we see a lot of skepticism among the leaders, the executives. Do you know why, and like how that can be overcome?
Yeah. So first, I think we have to recognize that I always say AI has kind of left the lab and entered the boardroom very quickly, and in that process of entering the lab, exiting the lab and entering the boardroom very quickly and starting to being used, there are certain steps that maybe would have normally occurred had it taken a longer time, but they haven't occurred. We ended up with this situation where we have a lack of standards when it comes to developing artificial intelligence. And there aren't really policies and rules around what needs to be done. Now that's looking back 5 years ago. Good news is that there's a lot of advancement that happened in the last 5 years. There are a lot of legislations and policies that have come up. But this is where we're kind of coming from, right? We're coming from a situation where tinkering in the lab entered the boardroom and started being used without some proper steps being put into place. Now everything would have been fine and dandy had there not been unintentional consequences. So we've seen in the last 5-ish years a rise in these unintentional consequences that have come out of this rapid use of artificial intelligence technology in the production space or in the boardroom, right? And there are many examples from healthcare to finance to higher ed that have really surfaced up, and you and your viewers have heard them, a good number of them, right? Like we've heard students being discriminated by computer systems that are monitoring the online proctoring exams because the system wasn't able to detect, a dark skinned face and kept saying that the person is not there and would fail them, right? That's a perfect example of an artificial intelligence solution that produced an unintentional consequence because it wasn't trained on enough dark skinned population. Right? We've seen it in healthcare. We've seen issues around, providers that are unintentionally discriminating against certain group of people because they used something like, let's say, cost of care as a proxy for needs, and therefore the systems recommended procedures to people that were traditionally paying for certain procedures, who turned out to be well educated and white. And we're not recommending procedures to those that weren't paying in the past because they didn't have the means, because they were, maybe in their social way, they were disadvantaged. So they were like, Hispanic, let's say, and Black population in this particular use case, right? And these are real cases. This is really what has happened. So when those use cases and those unintended consequences started to hit the media, right, because people are being affected, this is where you start to lose trust. And I think this is the key that is driving this mistrust in artificial intelligence. In healthcare especially, right, we're dealing, regardless what you pick, whether we're talking providers or payers or pharma, life sciences or med device, ultimately we're talking with human beings that if anything goes wrong, usually there's a significant impact, right? There's a significant issue that can happen. So the mistrust comes, I think, primarily from that angle of there's been enough wrong things that have happened. And people have been viewing this artificial intelligence as essentially a black box, and saying, well, we pipe some stuff in, and then something happens, and then something comes out on the other end, and like how do we trust what's happening in there? So you can unpack that a little bit, but like there are concerns around data, right, and the quality of data and where is that data coming from, and the bias within data itself, right? Because we have to recognize the fact that when we collect the data, there's already bias in that collection of data. Right? Again, there are many examples, right, that come from the bias being built in. So we're not going to run away from bias. The question is, we need to be able to recognize where it is, and then either try to eliminate it if we can, or at least be transparent about the fact that, an example, right, all the data we could get was a light-skinned population, and when we used our AI system to detect, whether your skin has melanoma or not, it's not going to work on dark-skinned population. Dear doctor, just so you know, right? But that's not a live example. That actually happened in Australia, and people were not aware, so they started to mistrust the solution.
Yep. AI is a machine; it's an intelligence built, but what's more important is the underlying data, right? Everything is based on the data.
Yeah, everything is based on data for sure as one of the key starting points and key starting steps, right? The processes that designers and the algorithm implementations take place, and the models that take place. There's also a lot to do with that. How do you take that data? Which parts of data you use for training? Which do you use for validation? Like, there's a lot of components to it, and I think that ultimately, there's been a lot of focus on accuracy. Can a model predict accurately what is going to happen? And in that process of predicting and focusing on accuracy, we had unfortunately, skipped these other important steps. That you could have an accurate model, but that doesn't mean that the model is safe. Or in other words, that it's not going to produce unintended consequences. And all of these examples that I kind of mentioned, all of those models were accurate, until you look at the details and you go, well, wait a minute. But what about this scenario? What about this group of people? And you're like, oh, well, we didn't have data for it. Of course, it's not covering it. Right? Now, I want to mention one thing, because I attended some seminar by one of the universities here in Chicago area, and there was an interesting comment from one of the professors, and this professor said, we shouldn't call this unintended consequences. Because it diminishes the importance or the impact of it. And I'm kind of torn between a little bit, right? Because to me, an unintended consequence is truly what it is. Nobody truly sat down and created an algorithm that on purpose discriminated against somebody. So the outcome is unintended consequence. But that doesn't mean that is not important. It was unintended. Yet, it doesn't mean that it should be looked over, that should be, swept under the rug or anything like that. Actually, to me, it means that it needs to be really, really looked over and really kind of, worried about, So, again, just for your viewers, right, when I say unintended, I'm not trying to diminish it. Actually, we're focused on is the unintended consequences and eliminating those.